Our next panel is on disinformation and crisis. Disinformation, during the age of social media and the proliferation of many platforms, unfortunately, fake news sometimes spreads quicker than real news and fact-based news. Now, when fake news creates situations that are very undesirable and impact countries and individuals in a negative way, you have a crisis on your hands. And crisis management is a very important art that is gaining prominence, gaining further importance as we continue forward in this age of new age communications. Now, here to introduce our panelists and talk more about the panel.
Let me introduce our moderator first. He's our colleague, Ömer Kablan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him to the stage. He's a presenter at TRT World. And all our speakers will be joining us online, so let me introduce them quickly. It's my pleasure to introduce Timothy Coombs. He's a professor at Texas A&M University. And Ece Baban, she's an associate professor at Fenerbahçe University. Joining us online again, Wasim Halit, CEO of Blackbird. Joining us online, lastly, Jack Wallace. He's head of program information operations and disinformation at ASPI. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your session. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Strategic Communication Summit. The discussion is called Disinformation and Crisis, and one of the most pressing issues of our time is, of course, disinformation. We've heard in and out, day in, day out, the idea of fake news and disinformation, both spoken from politicians, both spoken from journalists, and of course, spoken amongst ourselves. And if you've been watching, reading, or following the news over the last several years, you've probably already realized that this is the golden age of conspiracy theories and fake news. And to talk more about this very challenging issue, I have some great panelists joining me. So I just want to start it off now with Wasim Khalid, who's the CEO and co-founder of Blackbird.ai, and he's consulted and advised government agencies and companies around the world on the dangers and countermeasures of the escalating information warfare arms race. Wasim, thanks for joining us. Let's start with you. Tell us, what exactly is disinformation and why is it a problem?
Thanks a lot. So, fake news, disinformation, I'd say, first of all, we have to understand that this is a placeholder term for a variety of systemic issues. The real issue here is not just fake news, it's narrative manipulation, it's coordinated, inauthentic behavior. And these are often focused on hot button topics that are designed to polarize all of us against one another. So, for us and in our research, our approach has been, how do you understand how online actors manipulate information streams to shift human perception? Something that is essentially a cyber attack on human perception and what drives human behavior. So it's a much bigger problem than just fake news. And I think the big problem that we have today and communicators in general, today's intelligence systems are operating from kind of this old belief that the conversations online are coming from real humans, right? And they're not. So when you look at things like keywords and how happy or sad people are, it's really an unsuitable proxy for the new and novel risks that we see today. Then the metrics that are being used, and certainly I'm thinking of it from the perspective of how do we quantify using technology, these old metrics were never designed for sophisticated tradecraft that we see online. So social media has just shattered this notion that nations or corporations can message from the top down and control the narrative. It's no longer linear, the dangers. So, today's playbook that people use are still somewhat linear. And today it's about decentralized, moving at the speed of Twitter, and requires entirely new methods to make sense of. And I just say the last thing here in terms of what it is, we're on the verge of some much more advanced weaponized systems using AI towards automated generation of fake news and the spread of manufactured realities with minimal effort. It really will enable our adversaries to flood the zone with much more than we see today. So organizations really need to shift their mindset to address this technology arms race in a very serious way. They need to invest the time and the resources to shore up capabilities here. Otherwise, they're going to be sideswiped.
Thanks, Wasim. Now, I just want to move on to Associate Professor Ece Baban from the Communications Department at Fenerbahce University. And her area of expertise includes global terrorism and communication strategies. Ece, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us, because a lot of researchers have difficulty explaining exactly what disinformation is, and it's the widespread influence of disinformation, especially through social media and other platforms, is causing a lot of chaos, and that's why we've been seeing it more and more on the news. So how would you define it?
Teknoloji ve toplum, yani teknolojik gelişmeler aynı zamanda toplumsal gelişmeler hem medya alanını, yani sosyal medyayı ve sosyal medyanın kullanım alanını ve özellikle de Twitter açısından baktığımız zaman dezenformasyonun, yani yanlış bilginin hem depolanacak hem bir kaynak olarak kullanılacak hem de yayılacak, saklanılacak, paylaşılacak ve tüketilecek bir platform olarak kullanılması, bilginin ne kadar bilgi çağında yaşadığımızı ve bilginin hayatı şekillendirmede, algıları şekillendirmede ne kadar önemli olduğunu düşündüğümüzde aslında dezenformasyonun hayatımıza girmesiyle birlikte ve dezenformasyonun bu sosyal medya platformlarında kontrolsüz bir şekilde paylaşılmasıyla birlikte aslında çok geniş bir alanda insanların yanlış ya da yalan bilgiyi de depoladığını, sakladığını ve paylaştığını ve yaydığını görüyoruz. Ben buna şöyle bir örnek vermek istiyorum. Bir hatalı bir karar verdiğiniz zaman tıp alanında, yanlış bir tedavi uyguladığınız zaman bir insanın hayatına mal olur bu. Aynı zamanda hukuk alanında yanlış bir karar verirseniz bir insanın hayatından çalarsınız. Aynı şey dezenformasyonla alakalı da yanlış bir bilgiyi sosyal medya kaynaklarından özellikle paylaşıp kitlelerin algısını oluşturmakta, onları harekete geçirmekte, provokasyonlarda, manipülasyonlarda, post-truth gerçeklikle birlikte bütün bunların hepsi paylaşıldığında maalesef kitlelerin hayatlarına mal olabilecek bir takım eylemlerin hayata geçmesinde önemli bir etkiye sahip olursunuz. Dolayısıyla burada sosyal medyada, özellikle Twitter'da çok fazla bilginin paylaşıldığını ve bu aynı anda birçok veri paylaşılırken bunların doğruluğunun kontrol edilmesinin ne kadar zor olduğunu göz önüne aldığımızda, tekniğin olanaklarıyla yeniden üretimlerin yapıldığı bir çağda olduğumuzu düşündüğümüzde, yani geçmişte belki şahit olmadığımız ama bize yeniden toplumun hafızasını dinç tutmak için ötekileştirmelerde biz ve onlar tartışmasında, karşıtlıkların geliştirilmesinde, dostlukların devam etmesinde, yani bundan sonra gelecekte bazı durumları, bazı ülkeleri, bazı bilgileri nasıl tanımlamamız gerektiği bize sosyal medya araçları tarafından ve tabii ki geleneksel medyayla da söylenirken bunun yanlış bilgiler üzerine inşa edilmesinin sadece yaşadığımız çağda değil, gelecekte yeni jenerasyonun yaşayacağı çağda da çok önemli etkiler bırakacağını söyleyebiliriz. O yüzden de hem dezenformasyon hem de türevlerinin özellikle sosyal medya platformlarında bir kaynak haline gelmesi, paylaşılacak ve daha geniş alanları etkileyecek bir durumda olması aslında tüm dünya için endişe verici bir durum. Yani bize bu şekilde şunu söyleyebiliriz ki dezenformasyonla mücadele ve aynı zamanda doğru bilginin paylaşılması özellikle çok büyük öneme sahip.
Okay, and I just want to bring in Professor Dr. Timothy Coombs now, who's a full professor at the Department of Communication at Texas A&M University, and he's also authored an award-winning book called Ongoing Crisis Communication. Timothy Coombs, thanks for joining us. I want to ask you, now we're trying to explain disinformation, but let's also explain why are people trying to create disinformation? I mean, what's the gain from it?
Well, usually what you have on the other end is it's a purposeful attempt for them to achieve some goal of their own. They're trying to undermine, perhaps it might be an election, it might be trying to raise questions about a government, it could be to hurt a corporation in some way, either financially or reputationally. But there's always some objective too, and I think, as Wasim pointed out, that this is a cyber attack on perceptions, and they're trying to manipulate perceptions for their own goals. There are some who are just trolling and do it to create chaos, but most of this misinformation is very purposeful and designed to achieve some very specific objectives.
And now I'd like to bring in Dr. Jake Wallace, who's head of the program Information Operations and Disinformation at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's International Cyber Policy Center. Jake, also thank you for joining us. Now, I'd like you to explain to us the concept of fake news and why it's become such a huge phenomenon and why we're all of a sudden all talking about it.
Well, firstly, thanks for the opportunity to talk to everybody today. It's getting late here in Canberra in Australia, but I'm very grateful to be able to speak with you. So fake news, I think, as Wasim mentioned, I think there's a lot of placeholder terms that we can draw on in this space. I had a previous career as an academic, and since I gave that up, I try not to get too bogged down in definitions because I think it can be slightly unhelpful at times. But I think following up on Timothy's comments, I think this is really about strategic deception. And how a range of actors with diverse motivations are trying to shape the information environment. And we look at that whole spectrum of actors who may be financially, politically, or geostrategically motivated to manipulate the information environment for some strategic, to further some strategic goal, and the penetration of social media amongst populations simply creates an attack surface, a vector that just hasn't been available before. And there's plenty of actors who are very keen to exploit that opportunity. So, for example, here in the Asia Pacific region, where I'm obviously based down in Australia, we see that full spectrum of activity. There are content farms here in Australia, Singapore, Taiwan, all of whom are trying to shape the interactions on social media amongst these populations in an area of the world that is highly networked, that has highly educated populations, but it also has a really a surplus of cheap digital labor. So these kind of actors at the base of the internet economy can take opportunity. In many ways, it's quite entrepreneurial. In Australia, back in 2019, we saw actors from Macedonia, Albania, Republic of North Macedonia, all trying to shape the conversation around the Australian federal election. Now, that wasn't for geostrategic gain. It was purely financial. They were using fake news to steer audiences out of social media environments into content farms where they could generate advertising revenue. But I think that really highlights how events like elections become significant targets for this diverse range of actors.
Okay, and I'd like to bring Wasim back into the conversation here. Now, Wasim, one thing we're hearing from a lot of governments now is that disinformation is so critical that it could be detrimental to a country's political, social, and economic stability. How so? How can it be so critical that it's jeopardizing such institutions?
Well, I think in any system where the public has to be informed, not having trust in institutions is going to create issues around trust. We've seen this erosion of trust over the last several years. I mean, I think just the fact that people have resigned to the fact that we live in a post-truth world, or the fact that people think that, says a lot. You have to have a well-informed public in order for society to function over the long run. So if the media environment is seen to be something that can be gamed, or just the public discourse also gameable to distort reality completely, how do you form trust in societies? And without trust, how can people be expected to be rational? So it's very good that more and more often today, we see the concern in these areas, as we've been kind of looking at these problems since 2015. And early on, we're very concerned that no one was talking about this. God, if you want a really recent example, just, after this talk, or for people who are watching in front of their computers, just Google "birds aren't real." I know these things are funny sometimes. This is a conspiracy that all birds are government-made drones. Just let that sink in for a second. And just a few days ago, the New York Times did a feature with a 23-year-old that started this satirical conspiracy years ago. We've kind of been looking at this for a while, trying to figure out if this is a satire. He's gone public saying this was just a ruse, just a gag. Problem is, the reason I bring this up is that the believers still won't stop believing. And these are the consequences of an ecosystem that allows for any idea, even these very outlandish ones, to spread rapidly to the masses. So when you have problems like vaccinations and anti-vax and health and climate change and all of these different issues that people need to be well informed on, well, we have a system that people just haven't put any real faith in the last several years. And I think that's why the concern is very real, and people should be concerned.
Now, I'd like to bring back Ece. Wasim spoke of some of the challenges, of course. Now, what are some of the methods being used by governments, by other institutions to help counter disinformation?
Okay. Tabii ki sosyal medyanın dezenformasyonu, sosyal medyada dezenformasyonu kullanılmasında ve aynı zamanda da özellikle dünyada dezenformasyonun kullanıldığı durumlara baktığımız zaman nasıl önlemler alınmalı ya da bunlarla nasıl mücadele edilmeli diye ele aldığımız zaman özellikle ben birazcık daha Twitter üzerinden bunu örnekleyerek belki de gitmek istiyorum. Çünkü en çok haber portalı olarak, haber platformu olarak kullanılan Twitter ve Twitter'ın bu şekilde kullanılması ve etki alanını genişletmesi, özellikle insanların daha çok Arap Baharı mesela olaylarından sonra ya da Twitter'ın birazcık daha fazla özgürlük, umut, evrensellik ve sınırsızlık kavramlarını kendi kuş aslında sembolünün kanatlarını genişleterek daha fazla bu alanda hizmet vereceğini, bu alanda bilgi paylaşılacağını söyledikten sonra 140 karakteri 280 karaktere çıkarttıktan sonra bilginin aslında ne kadar fazla özellikle bir diplomasi kanalı olarak da kullanılarak son zamanlarda bilginin nasıl paylaşıldığını gördük. Şimdi bu paylaşımlarda çeşitli örnekler karşımıza çıktı. Mesela post-truth dediğimiz zaman aklımıza gelen özellikle yönetimlerde yöneticilerin ya da gerçekten kamuoyunda söz sahibi olan, etki alanı olan insanların Twitter'ı bir diplomasi alanı olarak kullandığını, burada da gerçeklerin daha çok bilgiye dayalı değil de daha duygulara dayalı olarak insanlara yeniden oluşturularak verildiğini gördük. Post-truth deyince sanırım hepimizin aklına gelen iki tane bir kavram ve bir isim var. Hem Brexit'te çok fazla gördük hem de Donald Trump çok iyi bir şekilde post-truth kavramını kullanarak aslında hayatımıza Twitter'la birlikte, diplomasiyle birlikte soktu. Şimdi mücadele açısından baktığımız zaman özellikle çerçevelemenin çok önemli olduğunu ve yanlış bilgiler paylaşıldıktan sonra doğru bilgilerin bu çerçeveleme ile birlikte bize sunulmasının çok önemli olduğunu söyleyebiliriz. Çerçeveleme nedir diye baktığımız zaman da şunu ifade edebiliriz ki Twitter'da çok fazla yanlış bilgi görsellerle birlikte sunulabiliyor. Yani sosyal medyada özellikle biz bir bilginin sadece yazı olarak değil de görselle birlikte bizimle paylaşıldığını gördüğümüz zaman daha inandırıcı ve daha gerçekmiş gibi algılanmasına neden olabiliyor. Dolayısıyla bu bilgiler paylaşıldığında ki baktığımız zaman Twitter'ın mesela 2019 verilerinde aktif kullanıcı sayısı 326 milyon, günlük paylaşılan tweet ortalama 500 milyon. Bu saniyede 5787 tweetin paylaşıldığını bize gösteriyor ki bir tweetin ömrü 50 dakika. Bu da bize bilginin ne kadar çabuk eskidiğini ve yeni bir bilginin geldiğini, yeni bilginin bu bilgi trafiğinde bizim doğru bilgiyi yakalayıp ya da paylaşılan bilgilerin doğruluğunu check etmenin ne kadar zor olduğunu bize gösteriyor. O yüzden de özellikle bu süreçte önemli olan konularda toplumun algısının ya da dünyadaki kamuoyunun algısının yeniden şekillendirilebileceği, sadece gerçeklere değil de duygulara hitap eden konuşmaların ya da bir takım etkileyici görsellerin paylaşıldığı durumlarda çerçeveleme ile birlikte metinlerin çerçevelenmesi ve görsellerin çerçevelenmesinde hangi duygular, hangi kelimeler kullanılmış. Bunlara karşı dezenformasyon, yalan bilgi ya da beraberinde işte doğru bilgi hashtagleri açılarak doğru fotoğrafların kullanılması ya da yanlış fotoğrafların tarihlerinin verilerek aslında gerçek ve yalanın sosyal medya platformlarında da özellikle Twitter'da paylaşılmasının çok önemli bir yöntem olduğunu söyleyebiliriz. Bunu da daha çok biz hem Barış Pınarı Harekatı'nda hem Covid-19 krizlerinde özellikle Anadolu Ajansı'nın paylaştığı haberlerle çok da fazla nasıl yönetilmesi gerektiğini gördük.
Okay. So let's move back to Timothy Coombs now. So this discussion is called Disinformation and Crisis. And your award-winning book is entitled Ongoing Crisis Communication. So we're hearing the word crisis. So can you explain to us what is the crisis exactly?
Yeah, the crisis is going to vary from the type of organization that's suffering from the misinformation, because at its core, a crisis is this perception by your stakeholders that something's wrong. You're not aligning with their interests in some way. So something is problematic. And let's take, for instance, the issue with COVID-19 and getting vaccinated or not. And so you have on one side the stream spinning out of anti-vaxxers, conspiracies that actually this is Bill Gates trying to inject you with microchips so he can track you in some way. Why Bill Gates would want to track people, that's another question, but that's part of the conspiracy that emerges. And so it can hurt organizations in different ways. This conspiracy, the anti-vaxxers, hurts a government's ability to engage in effective public health. That this is being undermined, and as a result, the virus spreads and keeps spreading because a certain percentage of the population will not get vaccinated. And we see this in other ways, governments having to shift their attention to deal with these problematic misinformation campaigns that takes their focus away from other more important tasks that they might have. And I think that's an underlying concept within a crisis, is a crisis diverts attention. When you label something a crisis, that means you want to give it time and attention, and that means you're not giving time and attention to something else. And any organization, be you a corporation, be you a government, be you a political party, when the crises come along created by this misinformation, you now have to deal with things you shouldn't have to deal with, and it makes it much more challenging. Now, I've been working with groups related to the pandemic since its beginning nearly 2 years ago, and that's a recurring theme, is having to spend time and resources on the misinformation and not just on addressing the public health concerns. And again, I use that just as an illustration. Any organization that finds itself sidetracked by this misinformation is not giving the time and resources to something that could be much more productive for them and for their stakeholders.
Okay. And let's go to Jake Wallace, because now we've heard Timothy talk about what the crisis is. And Jake, you're actually working for an organization that tries to counter this crisis. So what type of methods do you use, and how possible is it to entirely counter this crisis?
I think this is a really challenging space, Omar, and there's quite a high threshold for the kind of technical capability that's required to analyze disinformation at scale. There are a number of challenges around getting access to the right data. There are challenges around attribution and the precision of attribution. So attribution that is strong enough for us to call out bad actors who are willing to perpetrate information operations and disinformation campaigns. So a number of challenges, but I think, so in our instance here at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, we're fortunate enough to work very closely with the social media companies. So we get access to data that others don't necessarily, and we have technical insights that emerge from working with those companies that are very helpful to us as we analyze kind of open source information at scale. The kinds of capabilities that we use are built around applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning, natural language processing, so we can analyze the kinds of traits that malign actors will leave behind, the kind of footprints that they'll leave in their linguistic data, the kind of behavioral patterns that they display as they try to disseminate false narratives. And all of those techniques can be really useful. And I'm sure they'll be the kind of techniques that Blackbird AI are using in offering these kinds of services to companies. But I think the technical capability, certainly for those of us who work in the kind of not-for-profit space, I think for many governments as well, the technical capability is quite challenging. I think that this is an adversarial space, so the bad actors are consistently improving as we improve our defenses, and even the social media companies themselves would acknowledge that, because they have, you know, already made significant investments in their kind of algorithmic layer of defense, as well as the human resource capability that they have on the security teams. So I think essentially the defenses around building really sophisticated AI, ML, natural language processing systems that can adapt as our adversaries adapt in this space.
Mm-hmm. Now, Wasim, so let's try to bring this back to layman's terms. Okay, so for example, personally, I would say I'm an average social media user. I probably spend about an hour on Twitter, on Instagram, maybe an hour and a half. And most of us are like that. We spend maybe an hour, 2 hours on our social media feeds. So is someone like me, an ordinary social media user, how much am I exposed to disinformation?
It does depend on certainly a number of factors, like your browsing habits and whatnot, because people tend to get targeted more based on what they look at. Once people, actors understand what types of things engage you more. But just stepping back to speaking about crisis, because I think I can put it into some terms that might be helpful for people. Everybody who is on the internet today, on social media in particular, has to assume that they're most likely being manipulated at some point about something. This used to be ad tech marketing. What is marketing? I mean, it's shifting people's perception to perhaps buy something at a particular time. And in these systems where billions of dollars have been spent improving and refining them over the last decade or two, have now been hijacked by actors that are trying to shift our perceptions about things that are much more critical than what item to purchase. At Blackbird, our core focus is trying to accelerate the types of insights that major crisis management firms and ultimately down the road, hopefully we can provide things for individuals to better understand their environment. I think we explain things in something we call the 5 signals framework, right? And it attempts to get to root issues around crisis, root issues for individuals that are on the internet, and the things that we think about. I'm just gonna go through these signals real quick because it might give some context, something a little more concrete. So when we think about disinformation, the way we look at it is narrative. So these are online storylines that form around a topic or an organization or a company. We look at the entire network. So how do you visualize the evolving relationships online and the concepts they share? We look at what we think of as coalitions. So these are like-minded actors in their communities that seek to drive narratives together. So these could be anti-vaxxers, these could be Bitcoin bros in the crypto space. We look at things like manipulation. How do you distinguish between authentic and inauthentic behavior, including the spread of conspiracies, and finally influence? How do you detect and measure the impact of harmful actors and sometimes even trusted voices, essentially the nodes that shape the narrative? And I think one of the things that social media companies and just every organization needs to get around is if you can process all of these things at the same time at high enough speed, you can really build resolution to understand how might I be manipulated. And granted, we focus more on kind of the analyst in the organization, but everyone who is in the ecosystem suffers from these issues, whether you're a CEO or a policymaker or just all of us who are online. There needs to be better resolution when there are forces acting on us to move the needle on what we believe and what we think might be important.
Very interesting, Wasim. Now, I'm going to move back to Ece. So, Ece, can you also talk about why online media, advertising companies, marketing campaigns, and so on would also benefit from disinformation?
Dezenformasyonun temelinde aslında olan şeye baktığımız zaman sosyal medyada daha çok neden dezenformasyonun tercih edildiğini ve dezenformasyon kampanyalarıyla belki de gerek pazarlama çalışmalarıyla gerek bunun reklam çalışmalarıyla neden bu kadar çok fazla sosyal medyada yani aslında belki de online platformlarda kullanıldığını söylersek şuna temas etmemiz gerekebilir. Öncelikle burada amaç nedir? İnsanlarda belli bir konuda belli bir davranış oluşturmak, yani tutum ve davranışlarında bir değişiklik meydana getirmek en basit haliyle. Bunu meydana getirirken bazen onları harekete geçirmek için yanlış bilgiler ya da yanıltıcı bilgiler vererek aslında onların bilimsel gerçeklerle yani aslında hakikatle hareket etmesini değil, daha çok duygularına yönelik, duygularıyla belli bir yöne onları kanalize etmek için dezenformasyonlar çok fazla kullanılıyor. Burada önemli olan belki de dikkat çekmek istenen yani dikkat çekilmesi gereken en önemli şey fark edilebilir ve akılda kalıcı bir takım unsurların seçilmesi. Bunu yaparken de aslında toplumların deneyimlerinden, geçmişlerinden, duygularından, daha öncesinde yaşadıkları olaylardan yararlanarak yanlış bilgilerin üretilmesi. Özellikle sosyal medya bu anlamda neden çok önemli? Çünkü herkes sosyal medyada artık bir içerik üreticisi. Sosyal medyada hepimiz bir etkide bulunabiliyoruz ve bu etkileşim giderek büyüyebiliyor ve bu sadece sosyal medya platformlarının kendi sınırlarında kalmıyor. Ben sosyal medya kullanıcısı olarak herhangi bir Instagram'ı da kullanabilirim ki burada sadece politika yapanların ya da politika inşa edenlerin, bir algı yönetimi gerçekleştirmek isteyenlerin kendini dünya kamuoyunda ve kendi kamuoyunda belirli olaylar karşısında haklı ya da insanların desteğini alabilecek şekilde yanlış bilgileri paylaşanların eylemlerinden bahsetmiyoruz. Aynı zamanda şundan da bahsedebiliriz. Mesela pandemiden bahsettik, pandemi sürecinden. Covid-19 zamanında özellikle hem hastalıkla ilgili çok fazla sosyal medyada yanlış bilgiye rastladık. Aşıyla ilgili şu anda çok fazla yanlış bilgiye rastlıyoruz. Kapanmalar ya da bu kapanmaların karşısında protesto ederek aslında kapanmamak için sokağa çıkan insanlarla karşılaştık. Bütün bu süreç içerisinde eve kapanılan dönemde aslında bir de hani insanların daha fazla tüketmesi, daha fazla kendi evlerinin alanında yani kamusal alanda değilken kendi alanlarındayken nerede vakit geçirdiler? Sosyal medyada. Sosyal medya artık yeni bir kamusal alan olarak karşımıza çıktı. Bu kamusal alanda insanların demek ki düşüncelerini, davranışlarını şekillendirebilecek, onları harekete geçirebilecek bilgiler kadar ne yazık ki yani doğru bilgiler kadar, enformasyon kadar dezenformasyon da kullanıldı. Ve burada sadece insanların evde olması değil, aynı zamanda evdeyken işte hangi konu hakkında nasıl düşünmesi gerektiği, nasıl tepki vermesi gerektiği, neyi tüketmesi gerektiği, daha fazla tüketmesi gerektiğiyle ilgili belki de birçok haber pompalandı, birçok bilgi pompalandı. Bütün bunlar sonucunda tabii ki sosyal medyanın insanları kendi etkisi altına almak ve onları bir şekilde davranışa yönlendirmek için bir araç olarak kullanılması aynı zamanda dezenformasyonda da en büyük kaynak olarak kullanılmasına yol açtı. Bugün biz bir şeyi araştırırken siz de bahsettiniz. Google arama motoruna giriyoruz ve oradan soruyoruz, oradan bir cevap almaya çalışıyoruz. Burada yanlış bilgiler ne kadar çok yani dezenformasyon ne kadar çok birikirse bundan sonraki şu anda yaşadığımız dünya ve gelecekteki dünya ile alakalı olarak aslında yanlış inşa edilmiş bilgilerden, yanlış algılardan oluşan ve yanlış tepkiler ortaya çıkartılabilecek. Yanlış derken şundan bahsediyorum. Dezenformasyon neden yapılır? Bir toplumda bazen o toplumun insanların yani kamuoyunun belli bir konuda kendini kötü hissetmesi, bazen onların negatif etkilenmesi için yanlış ve yalan bilgiler verilir. Ve bunun üzerine ya dünya kamuoyunda ya da iç kamuoyunda bir tepki oluşturulmaya çalışılır. Ama bunlar pozitif duygular ve pozitif eylemler üzerine dezenformasyon çok fazla kullanılmaz. Dolayısıyla burada bakmamız gereken şey hem sanal dünyada, yani mesela yapay zekayı kullanıyoruz değil mi? Bizim için çok önemli. Çünkü yapay zekaya bir bilgi yüklüyoruz. Ve o bilgiyi yapay zeka makineler kendi aralarında etkileşime geçerek o bilgiden farklı bilgiler üretip etkileşim alanı yaratıyorlar. İşte ne kadar doğru bilgiyi aslında kullanırsak yanlış eylemlerin ortaya çıkmasını da o kadar engelleriz. Çünkü dezenformasyonlar hiçbir toplumda kamunun yararına, yani halkın yararına kullanılmamakta. Dolayısıyla bunu pazarlama alanında da, reklam alanında da, yani baktığınız zaman size ürünlerle ilgili de ya da satın alma davranışlarınızla ilgili de, oy verme davranışlarınızla ilgili de her zaman bir etki altında kalabilecek bir düzenin içerisinde olduğumuzun farkına vararak, belki de dezenformasyon ve yaratılan krizlerle birlikte medya okuryazarlığının ve gerçekten farklı kanallardan doğru bilgiye ulaşmanın ne kadar önemli olduğunu farkındalığının da arttırılması çok önemli. Çünkü sosyal medya artık bizim hayatımız, sadece sosyal medya değil, akıllı teknolojik aletler de bizim hayatımızın bir parçası.
Okay. Now, I just want to go back quickly to Wasim. So, Ece was talking about how social media has become so interventional in our lives. It's a direct intervention, including what we think, how we act, how we decide. Do you find the future to be bleak in the sense that, you know, we're putting so much trust into social media?
I mean, this is more of a personal stance, right? I don't find the future to be bleak, but I do sometimes find that this work, you'd think people would have more uptake on it. Let me just say this. So social media companies, first of all, they have to continue to invest in this space. They have to continue to do takedowns, but at a much higher rate. But everyone often thinks about this through the lens of a particular social platform, and no one platform can actually solve this issue. In fact, there is no solving this issue. There's only getting better resolution, faster resolution on the issue. You actually need ecosystem-wide analysis to understand the emergence and evolution of the threats that we're seeing today that can impact organizations at all levels. I mean, I know I just said things aren't bleak, but I think one point really needs to be made here. If you look closely at every major debate, whether it's policy or sustainability or the culture wars, every hot button issue that impacts the world today, when they appear in the media or on social or in the public sphere, they are plucked straight from the virtual realm and used as a guide for real world action. And I hate to say this, but I mean, the real world is getting more and more similar to a downstream version of what happens on Twitter, what happens on social. So I'd say we should all be very concerned. It makes it all the more critical that leaders and communicators understand the environment and invest time and resources to enable kind of new frameworks of thought, new technology, new playbooks for understanding what is actually happening, the hidden mechanisms, the information flow, and how to get ahead of these issues. But I do think this is, you know, at least from our perspective, the reason I think the future does look bright, and that's, you know, everybody at this conference, for example, is thinking actively about these issues and trying to move the needle. But we do need to focus. We need to focus on high-speed, scalable technology. Of course, I'm going to be a little biased there because I think technology is the solution in this arms race. But we have to analyze information to reveal manipulative messaging at their point of emergence, to better understand and anticipate these threats, and frankly, to deploy a modernized response playbook, and just be able to start to detect these things. I think everybody goes straight to how will you solve the problem. I think, first of all, you have to be able to measure something before you can mitigate and understand. And I think we're on the path to that. And I'm very optimistic based on, you know, all the discussions I've heard here in the past day or so.
Jake Wallace, what do you think the problem? How is it solvable? How do you project the future will be?
So I tend to agree with Wasim. I think that this will be an adversarial situation. I think cybersecurity is a good metaphor. This is a challenge that isn't going away. So we need to think about how to mitigate risk. We need to think about what the attack surfaces are. We need to think about how to enable a degree of media literacy that allows citizens in democracies to continue to participate politically without being overwhelmed by manipulation from external actors. And I think we need to think beyond the technical level. We need to think about what are the kind of problem-solving structures that we need to put in place to enable societal level responses. So how do we get government to work with social media companies? How do we get government and industry working together? How do we get civil society and industry working together? And I think there are a number of really interesting models. In particular, I'm thinking of the Hybrid Threat Center in Helsinki, or NATO's Center of Excellence in Strategic Communications. But there are a number of domains in which these kinds of models and the formulation of them become particularly challenging. Again, turning to my own region here in the Asia Pacific, we have a range of political systems. We have a range of regimes with differing thresholds for plurality within the information domain. So how do we create structures that enable some degree of diplomatic engagement across that spectrum of democracy? And how do we enable industry to be proactive about mitigating risk within that operating environment? I think those are challenging questions that are beyond the kind of technical layer. They're about how do we get organizations and sectors working together to mitigate risk.
Timothy Coombs, please join in the conversation. What do you feel? What do you think the future will look like? How do you see the counteractive measures against disinformation?
Yeah, I think we have to accept a future that polarization is going to be what we naturally encounter, because that's what a lot of the misinformation and disinformation is about, creating polarization. And the technology to help identify it and early and remove it is great, and I think serves a function. But once something is out there, it's out there and it sticks. And I think we're just going to be within that environment of polarization. And we need to learn how to navigate that. How are you going to work where you have groups that you know you are not going to be able to relate to in a meaningful way? Because one of the reasons conspiracy theories catch on is that they resonate with people. And once they have that resonance, you're not going to move them off of that. And unfortunately, if you want to talk about bleak, look at the research on trying to deal with misinformation. Once people have it, it's very, very bleak. They're not going to be able to change that. So how do we navigate that as strategic communicators when we have been building a lot of strategic communication around this notion of, oh, well, we kind of all work together and we're moving towards consensus. Well, how do we live with dissensus and polarization? And how do we work with that as strategic communicators? And that's the challenging part of it. And I think is one of the key points of why this is no longer linear. Some of what we do in strategic communication is linear, always has been linear, and always will be linear in how we approach it. But more and more, what we do will not be linear. It's going to just evolve out of the situation. And we're going to need to really work on that notion of improvisation and how we work with these various publics, because there is no one path forward. There are going to be multiple paths forward. And those multiple paths is what creates this flux and this need to not think linear anymore and try to just adjust as we see what's coming along. So I think there's a lot of challenges that I think strategic communication is up to. It's just going to need to shift that focus from thinking about consensus and bringing people together to how do we work meaningfully with polarized groups of people.
And Timothy, while we're speaking to you on this issue, can you also just, for our audience and for those who have trouble understanding the differences, can you tell us the difference between disinformation misinformation and propaganda?
Oh, yeah, that's a challenging one. I see disinformation is information that's incorrect that just floats out there and gets circulated around. There's no particular agenda behind it. Someone sees something, they share it, and it's wrong. That occurs. More often what we're seeing is misinformation, and misinformation is purposeful. As I mentioned before, there's a reason for it. People are putting it out there to achieve some type of objective. And it's not just for fun, as was the case with, birds aren't real, but they have some specific goal that they're trying to achieve through it. And propaganda has always been a questionable term because it depends on your perspective. One person's propaganda is another person's truth. And we're seeing that now. One person's misinformation is another person's set of facts. And so there's always that interpretive nature to it. And so propaganda has always been kind of that perspective. It's like, oh, you're doing that to deceive me in some way. We think of propaganda as deception, when propaganda really at its roots comes from the Catholic Church and is about spreading of faith and spreading of ideas. And so propaganda became corrupted as a term to mean, oh, you're spreading information I don't like, which is the same thing we see with fake news being used as a term to say, oh, that's something I disagree with, therefore it's fake news. So I think the key differences are really that misinformation and disinformation. And our biggest problem that we face is the misinformation, the purposeful use of information that is incorrect.
Now I want to move back to Jake Wallace for a moment. Jake, can you just talk about, do we know who the big actors are when it comes to disinformation? I mean, of course, maybe we come across smaller disinformation campaigns. We're talking about, individual social feeds and so on. But do we know the bigger actors?
I think we do. Obviously, I think a lot of the discussion around disinformation, information operations has been framed by Russian meddling in the 2016 US presidential election. But there are certainly other actors at play and really useful resources to explore the kind of dynamics and perhaps create a leaderboard of who's the most prolific actor would be to kind of have a look at the information operations archive that Twitter makes available. But I think certainly Russia and China are up there, and I think what's really interesting to see play out is the distinctions in how these actors operate. So Russia favors a more disruptive approach and is very focused on the transatlantic security alliance, particularly as it impacts its Western fringe, its kind of traditional buffer of influence. The actor that we're most focused on here in our work at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is China, because the Asia Pacific will be the nexus of great power competition over the next decade, and what we're seeing at play is a battle for influence, and that battle for influence plays out across a number of planes, but it certainly plays out in the information domain, and I think this is the challenge for democracies. How do they engage with threats in the information domain that are strategic and that are at scale and that are part of a suite of kind of aggressive statecraft by actors willing to deploy hybrid threat tactics? And that's a learning curve for democracies. This is a space that many democracies are not kind of comfortable playing in. Although we're starting to see frameworks emerge from a number of states, a number of democratic states, that are starting to think about how you create kind of ethical defense and kind of offense in the information domain. Good examples are how the US kind of now defends forward and is quite overt about its willingness to defend forward. It did so in the 2018 midterm elections and took the Internet Research Agency offline for a period. I think in terms of China's really at scale information operations, states are kind of learning to try to find ways to counter that kind of longer term strategic goal that China has to shape the information environment and to influence states. And we've seen that really significantly play out through COVID-19 with Chinese state media, Chinese diplomats disseminating propaganda and disinformation around the origins of the virus, around China's role in offering medical supplies to a range of states, particularly those in North Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So I think states are having to learn how to develop the situational awareness that allows them to get an overview of the landscape in the information domain, and they're trying to develop the ethical frameworks that democracies can operate within in terms of kind of competing and contesting in the information domain.
Okay, and now we're approaching the last 5 minutes of this session. If there's a question in the audience, I can take it. If not, I'm going to continue with my last question. So this has been quite enlightening, of course, because we all speak about disinformation quite often. Now, as we approach the last 5 minutes, we're getting into the concluding remarks now. And I just want each of you to explain the work you're involved in when it comes to dealing with disinformation, and also how you think all of us individually are going to be impacted by it. So, Eje, if we can start with you, how are we impacted by disinformation individually and collectively? And in terms of the work you do, where do you see this going?
Dezenformasyonla hem mücadelede hem de dezenformasyonun gelecekte aslında daha az dezenformasyona daha az maruz kalmak ve aynı zamanda da demokratik bir ortamda, yani sosyal medya, online platformlar gibi demokratik ortamlarda bilginin paylaşılmasının aslında yanlış bilgi paylaşılarak insanların algılarının yönetilmesiyle ayrımının sağlanmasında uygulamaların, check edilecek uygulamaların, bir takım filtrelerin, ama burada düşünce özgürlüğünü ifade etmekten ya da bunu kısıtlayacak filtrelemelerden değil, ama önemli konularla alakalı özellikle kamuoyu liderleri ve siyasi liderlerin paylaştığı bilgilerin doğruluğu ve toplumu ilgilendiren konularda dezenformasyonun kullanılmasını engelleyebilecek bir takım uygulamaların, check edilecek uygulamaların oluşturulması ve bundan sonraki süreçte özellikle şuna dikkat çekmek istiyorum. Sosyal medya çok burada önemli, çünkü sanal evrenler aslında oluşturularak insanlar aynı zamanda gerçeklikten bir şekilde de koparılarak sanal evrenlerde bir metaverse ile birlikte mesela daha farklı bir hayatın içinde yer alabiliyorlar. Bu da gerçek kamuoyunu oluşturduğumuz ortamlarda bilginin doğruluğunun, gerçekliğinin öneminin zaman zaman azalmasına neden olabiliyor. Daha geniş bir konsepte bunun ele alınıp öneminin ve bununla mücadelenin, doğru bilgi paylaşmanın uygulanabilir şekilleri, versiyonlarının hayata geçirilmesinin önemli olduğunu söyleyebilirim.
Thank you, Eje. Wasim, let's go to you. Concluding remarks, where you see all of this going?
Well, we certainly believe that disinformation is the umbrella crisis that really fuels every major crisis the world will face in the coming decades. And I say that without any hyperbole. I mean, manipulated media at large is no longer just a reputational concern or, how your communities are functioning. It is a financial concern. There are organizational security concerns across healthcare, government, technology companies, healthcare. So we have to battle this kind of harmful information landscape. We have to understand the landscape full of these unexpected risks. And like was said before, we have to understand how to also live in this kind of polarized system that we've all built for ourselves. At Blackbird, we primarily study narrative manipulation with an AI-driven platform. And this is designed for actual use by communications firms, Fortune 500s, so that they can get a better sense of how to navigate the minefield that we all find ourselves in, and hope we can help with that with organizations and anyone who may need it in the future and today. Thank you.
Thank you, Wasim. Timothy, let's move on to you.
Now, I would like to just kind of echo that. I think AI is kind of the key to the future, because the AI is what allows us to identify early on, and some of the work I've been doing recently, looking at AI and how to identify various crisis threats. And I think that's critical, because the earlier you can address it, the more likely you are to have an effect on it. So I think, AI definitely is the direction for the future to help us try to cope and navigate through this situation.
And Jake Wallace.
So two points from me. One of our priorities is analyzing data with precision so that we can offer a degree of both transparency and deterrence in the information environment, and as a way of providing a bit of pushback on those who are willing to manipulate the information environment. But I also think that what we want to do over the next 12 months, our big priority over the next 12 months, is all around building capacity. So I mentioned how high the threshold, I think, for this kind of work is. I'd like us to do a lot of capacity building work to see if we can build societal resilience elsewhere in our region. And I also think that one of the keys to engaging with this challenge productively is to bring together cross-sectoral stakeholders so that we can drive some real innovation in our policy responses. And that's another key strand of the work that we'll be doing over the next 12 months.
Thank you. Ece Baban, Timothy Coombs, Jake Wallace, Wasim Khalid, thank you so much for a very enlightening discussion. It was very beneficial for all of us, I believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.